Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on images. And I'm not just talking about the ones you scroll through on your phone.
Right.
No, we're going to go way deeper than that.
Yeah.
We're talking about how images are actually processed, both digitally by powerful algorithms and also by the amazing image processors that we all have built in our eyes.
Yeah, it is fascinating how these two worlds, the digital and the biological, they really are intertwined when it comes to image processing.
Absolutely. So we got a bunch of textbook excerpts here about things like color image processing and digital image processing techniques with a focus on how this stuff is actually used.
Yeah, and I think the practical applications of this stuff are really going to surprise some people.
You know what? You're right, because I was thinking about it, and this goes way beyond just like making photos look better.
Exactly. Yeah, and we will get to that stuff too, but we'll get there.
Okay, so let's get to the basics first.
Yeah.
What is digital image processing? What are we even talking about here?
So one of our sources, dip1.pdf, defines digital image processing pretty simply. It's basically using a computer to manipulate an image. But that manipulation can have a bunch of different goals. Sometimes it's about enhancing an image, so making it clearer or sharper or more vibrant.
Kind of like all those filters we see people use on social media, right?
Exactly. But the real power of digital image processing comes when you're trying to extract information from images. So take medical diagnosis. Doctors can analyze images, not just x-rays, but things like 3D models of genomes or even time lapses of cells to see things that the human eye would just miss.
Wow. Yeah, I'm starting to see how this is way more than just slapping a filter on your selfie or something.
Right.
Now, the source also mentioned forensics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Digital image processing is used in all sorts of forensic stuff, from fingerprint analysis to get this, DNA matching. It can even be used to automate some tasks like quality inspection in factories.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget self-driving cars.
Yeah.
I mean, they basically see the world through digital image processing, right? Yeah, they do.
It's kind of crazy to think about that something that started with, changing pixels on a computer screen is now helping machines navigate the real world.
You know, it's wild.
So speaking of pixels, let's talk about how these digital images are actually put together. Our next source, dip3.pdf, dives into this idea of the spatial domain. Basically, it's like talking about those tiny squares of color that make up every digital picture.
And when we manipulate those individual pixels, we can do some pretty amazing things. Like, have you ever heard of gamma correction?
Yeah, I think so. Doesn't that have something to do with how images look on different screens, like your laptop versus your phone?
Exactly. You know how sometimes a photo looks too dark on your laptop, but then looks totally fine on your phone?
Yeah.
Well, that's because different screens have different gamma values, which means they display brightness differently.
Hmm.
So gamma correction basically adjusts the image so it looks consistent across different devices.
So it's kind of like fine-tuning the brightness, but in a way that considers the specific screen you're looking at. That's a great way to put it, yeah. And that's just one example of what we can do in the spatial domain. We can stretch contrast, which is super useful in medical imaging, to make subtle details stand out. And there's thresholding, which is basically a way to isolate certain areas of an image.
Now, the next idea from dip3.pdf that we need to talk about is something that I usually think is pretty boring. I'm talking about histograms.
Yeah.
But apparently they're a lot more interesting when it comes to images.
They actually are. Histograms are basically a visual way to see how brightness is distributed in an image. It's like a bar graph where each bar shows a different level of brightness, and then the height of the bar shows how many pixels in the image have that brightness.
So it's like you're seeing like not just what's in the image, but how the light itself is like laid out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really useful for analyzing and enhancing images. In fact, the source mentions that histograms can actually reveal problems with an image before you can even see them with your eyes. Like, it can show you if a picture is underexposed.
So I bet that's super helpful for photographers, right?
It is, but it's also really important in scientific imaging too, because even small changes in brightness can mess up the results of an experiment. But histograms aren't just about finding problems, they can also help us solve them.
Like how?
Well, there's this technique called histogram equalization, and what it does is it basically takes a low contrast image and it just injects it with life. It takes those brightness levels and it redistributes them so you can see all the details that were hidden in the shadows or whatever.
Oh, wow. So it's like turning a blah image into something really vibrant.
Exactly. And this technique is used all over the place, from medical imaging, where it helps doctors see tiny details in tissue scans, to satellite imagery, where it can enhance features on the Earth's surface. shapes.
Okay, so this is all pretty cool, but our next source has a title that sounds kind of intimidating. It's called Morphological Image Processing. And it just makes me think about dissecting frogs in biology class or something.
Well, it does have a connection to biology in a way. So this type of digital image processing is all about analyzing and manipulating the shape of objects in an image. Think about like if you wanted to make a computer recognize a handwritten letter, or if you wanted to find the boundaries, all the different objects in a picture.
So instead of looking at the individual pixels, we're kind of zooming out to look at the big picture, literally.
Yeah, exactly. And the source mentions these things called structuring elements, which sound kind of complex.
Yeah, what are those?
Well, basically, imagine little shapes, kind of like probes, that we use to scan an image. And they help us to find and analyze specific features based on their shape and size. It's like using a cookie cutter to find all the stars in a bowl full of different shapes.
Okay, that analogy I get. So what do we do with those shapes once we find them?
So two of the key things we can do are called dilation and erosion. Dilation basically expands objects and erosion shrinks them.
That kind of sounds destructive, though. Like, is that a good thing?
It might sound weird, but it's really useful. Let's say you have a photo of a handwritten letter, but the lines are kind of broken up. Dilation could help to fill in those gaps and make the letter easier to read.
Oh, I see. So it's kind of like we're digitally repairing the letter. What about erosion? What would you use that for?
So erosion is great for things like region filling. Imagine a medical image of a tissue sample with a few little holes or gaps in it.
Okay, yeah.
Erosion can help smooth those out to get a more complete picture.
Wow. So we've gone from changing individual pixels to analyzing entire shapes and structures within images. It's amazing what we can do with computers. But you know what's even more amazing? We're doing a kind of image processing all the time without even thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
Right here in our own heads.
That's right. Our brains are constantly processing all the visual information that comes in from our eyes.
And that brings us back to our first source, DIP1.PDF, which talks about the human eye. I think it's time for a little biology lesson.
All right, let's do it.
So remind me, how do our own built-in image processors work?
It all starts with the retina, which is that light-sensitive layer at the back of the eye. The retina is covered in these special cells called photoreceptors that basically convert light into electrical signals that our brain can understand.
Right. And there are two main types of photoreceptors, rods and cones, right?
You got it. Rods are super sensitive to light, so they help us see in low light conditions, but they can't see color. Cones, on the other hand, are all about color.
Okay, yeah. And I remember learning that there are actually 3 different types of cones, each one sensitive to a different wavelength of light.
Exactly. We have L cones, which are most sensitive to long wavelengths of light reds and oranges. Then there are M cones, which are sensitive to medium wavelengths, greens, and yellows. And finally, there are S cones, which are all about the short wavelengths, blues and violets.
Wow, it's like a rainbow in our eyes.
It is.
So the reason we see colors is because of how these different cones are stimulated by the light that's bouncing off of whatever we're looking at, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like a symphony of light and color is happening in our eyes all the time. And another amazing thing about our eyes is their dynamic range.
Okay, now what is dynamic range?
So dynamic range is our ability to see in both super bright and incredibly dim conditions. Think about like walking out of a dark movie theater into the sunlight. Your eyes adjust almost immediately.
Yeah, that is amazing.
It is. But there's a catch, and this is where it gets interesting. So while our eyes can technically handle this huge range of light, we can't actually see all of those levels at once, and that's because of something called brightness adaptation.
So our eyes are constantly adjusting to how bright or dark it is around us.
Precisely. It's like our brains are saying, okay, it's bright in here, so let's just focus on the important stuff and ignore all those dim details. Or, on the other hand, it's getting dark, so let's amplify the low light signals so we can still see what's going on.
That's wild. Our brains are basically doing constant image processing, filtering out the unimportant stuff, and highlighting what is important. It's like having a built-in Photoshop.
Exactly. And that's just one example of how our visual system is working all the time to make sense of the world around us.
It really is complex.
And we're just starting to understand how it all works.
This is already a lot to take in. I mean, we've gone from these tiny little pixels to algorithms that can analyze entire shapes to this incredible complexity of our own eyes.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about just how cool our own eyes are, these amazing biological image processors.
Yeah, they really are a marvel of evolution.
But now I want to shift gears a bit and dive into some of the specific ways that digital image processing is being used out in the world. I'm talking about the stuff that's really pushing the boundaries.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm especially interested in facial recognition.
Mm.
I mean, it's everywhere these days, from unlocking our phones to, like you said earlier, even being used in forensics. But how does it actually work?
Well, at its core, facial recognition relies on a series of steps that are all powered by these digital image processing algorithms. So the first thing the system has to do is find the faces in an image or a video stream.
And I imagine that's not as easy as it sounds.
It's definitely not. A lot of times this involves techniques like edge detection and pattern matching. So basically, the algorithms are searching for all those features that make up a human face.
So it's more than just looking for two eyes, a nose, and a mouth.
Oh yeah, way more nuanced than that. The algorithms are analyzing things like the distances between those features, the shape of the jawline, even things like skin texture.
Well, wow, so it's like building this detailed map of each face.
Right. And then once it's detected a face, the system takes it a step further and extracts a set of unique features, sometimes called a face print.
So it's like a digital fingerprint, but for your face.
Exactly. And this face print is basically just a bunch of numbers that represent all those unique characteristics that we just talked about. And that face print can then be compared against a database of other faces.
So if it finds a match, bingo, you know who that person is.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. But of course, things in the real world aren't always perfect. Lighting, angles, even the quality of the image, all that stuff can affect how well this works in practice.
That makes sense. Okay, let's move on to another application that I find both fascinating and kind of scary. Self-driving cars. I mean, it still blows my mind that a car can see the road, understand traffic, and make decisions.
I know, it's really remarkable, and it's all thanks to this complex interplay between sensors and, you guessed it, digital image processing.
So can you break it down for me a little bit? Like, how does a car perceive things like lane markings and traffic lights and other cars, all those things that we just take for granted when we drive?
So self-driving cars use a whole bunch of different sensors, things like cameras, LiDAR, and radar, to basically build a 360-degree view of their surroundings. But it's the image processing algorithms that really turn all that raw data into usable information.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this right, it's kind of like facial recognition, but instead of identifying a person, the car is identifying all the different things in its environment.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. The algorithms are trained to recognize the visual patterns for all sorts of things, other cars, pedestrians, cyclists, even animals that might run into the road. And it all has to happen in real time, constantly updating as the car's moving.
That's a lot of processing happening.
It really is a lot to process. And on top of that, the system has to work in all sorts of different lighting conditions, whether you name it.
No wonder self-driving cars are still in development. It's such a complex problem. But the fact that we've gotten this far is still amazing. Okay, so we've talked about some really high-tech stuff, but I know that digital image processing is also used in much more everyday ways, like enhancing the photos and videos that we all take.
Absolutely. I mean, think about all those features on your phone's camera. Things like noise reduction, which helps get rid of the graininess in low-light photos, or sharpening filters, which really make details stand out. Those are all powered by digital image processing.
And what about all those filters we use on social media, the ones that make us look tan or airbrush our skin?
Yeah, those too. Basically, those filters are just applying pre-programmed image adjustments to change things like the color or the contrast, and yeah, sometimes even our facial features to create those effects.
It's amazing how digital image processing is just like built into so many things these days. From those silly little filters to technologies like self-driving cars that are really changing the future. I mean, it's everywhere.
It's really transforming so many different things. All this talk about how digital image processing helps us see things better got me thinking, though. Like, our own human vision, as incredible as it is, it still has limitations.
That's true. And earlier we were talking about brightness adaptation, how our eyes adjust to different lighting conditions. But what are some of the other limitations that affect how we see the world?
Well, one of the biggest ones is our field of view. Compared to a lot of animals, humans actually have a pretty narrow field of view. We only see clearly in a small area right in front of us, and then our peripheral vision is much less detailed.
That's so interesting. I've always wondered about that. Like, you see those birds of prey that can spot tiny animals from such a distance. Their vision must be insane.
Yeah, it's crazy. They have a much wider field of view than we do, and their visual acuity, basically how sharp their vision is far better than ours. And then there are some animals that can see entire ranges of light that are completely invisible to us, like ultraviolet or infrared light.
It's kind of humbling to realize that our vision is really only capturing a tiny fraction of all the light information that's out there.
I know, right? But that's also what makes digital image processing so powerful. It allows us to see beyond those limitations and see the world in ways that we never could before.
It's like we're constantly expanding our visual horizons.
Okay.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive, everything from the basics of digital images to some really mind-blowing applications. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how digital image processing is transformative. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's bigger than just the technology itself. I think digital image processing is changing how we interact with the world around us, how we get information, how we communicate, even how we express ourselves creatively. Just think about how much photography and video have exploded recently.
That's true. It seems like everyone's a photographer these days thanks to smartphones and all these easy-to-use editing apps.
Exactly. And that's just one example of how digital image processing is having a cultural impact. It's also changing things in fields like medicine, science, security, and so many others.
Yeah, I can see that. It really is woven into so many different parts of our lives. Okay, I think we're almost ready to wrap up this episode. Any last thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I'd just say take a minute to think about the power of images, both the ones we create and the ones we see with our own eyes. And maybe think about the role that digital image processing plays in shaping our visual world. I mean, this technology is always changing, so who knows what incredible things we'll be able to do in the future.
Yeah, it's wild when you think about it.
Yeah.
From like messing around with pixels to, all the incredible stuff we can do now.
It's really amazing what we can do. And, thinking about all these ways that we're using digital image processing in such practical ways and creative ways, it got me thinking. Do you know what I mean?
About?
Well, remember how we were talking about how our own eyes, they're limited?
Right.
Even with all the amazing technology we have now, with AI getting so smart, I wonder.
If a machine will ever really see the world like we do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that's been around for a long time. Like, we've come so far in developing AI that can recognize things in pictures, objects, patterns, even emotions. But is that the same as actually experiencing the world visually the way humans do, with all those little nuances and how we interpret things differently?
That's a great question. We can teach a machine what a tree is, but can we teach it to, I don't know, to feel that awe when it sees a forest?
Exactly. Like, can we teach it to appreciate a sunset? Or the way light shines on water? I mean, those are really personal, subjective experiences. Can we really replicate that with algorithms?
I don't know. It's something to think about, especially as AI keeps getting better and better. But, thinking about all this, about the limits of our own vision, even the potential limits of machines, makes me think about something else, too.
What's that?
The power of human imagination.
Right.
Because even if our eyes don't catch everything, even if algorithms don't perfectly copy our experience, we can still imagine.
Right. We can fill in the gaps with our minds, go beyond what we see right in front of us.
And that's what artists do, don't they? They take what they see and they change it, add their own emotions, how they see things, their own point of view.
Yeah, they do. And honestly, I think we all do that in some way. Every time we look at a picture, we're not just taking it in, we're engaging with it. Making our own meaning.
So really, we're all image processors, whether we're using computers or just our own minds.
I love that.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive. We've gone from pixels, the tiny building blocks, to AI and all its potential. We even talked about how our own vision works.
It's been a pretty incredible journey.
It really has. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And that maybe it sparked a little curiosity about the power and, honestly, the magic of how we see the world. Thanks for joining us.